Trump is threatening, but Canada is getting stronger. For decades, it was easier to ship wine from California to Toronto than from British Columbia to Ontario. A construction worker licensed in Alberta couldn't legally work in Quebec without retraining. A farmer in Saskatchewan faced more regulatory barriers selling beef to Manitoba than exporting it to Japan. This wasn't some bureaucratic accident. This was Canadian federalism at its most dysfunctional, a country that preached free trade to the world while maintaining internal borders that would make medieval Europe jealous. And then, Donald Trump started threatening to tear up North American trade. He called Canada the 51st state, slapped tariffs on steel and aluminum, and suggested economic annexation was inevitable. Trump thought he was crushing Canada. Instead, he accidentally did what generations of Canadian politicians couldn't. He forced Canada to finally tear down the walls between its own provinces. Tonight, we're showing you how Trump's threats triggered the most dramatic restructuring of Canada's internal economy in 50 years, how provinces that spent decades fighting each other suddenly became partners, and how what started as defensive panic became an economic revolution that's making Canada stronger than Trump ever imagined. But before we dive into this story, if you appreciate in-depth analysis like this, hit that like button and subscribe to stay informed on the stories that truly matter. Before we understand what changed, you need to grasp just how ridiculous the old system was. Imagine you're a craft brewery in British Columbia. You make excellent beer and you want to sell it in Ontario, 3,000 kilometers away. Sounds simple, right? Wrong. You'd need to navigate different labeling requirements in every province, different packaging standards, and different distribution rules. In some provinces, you couldn't sell directly to retailers. You had to go through government liquor monopolies that took massive cuts and prioritized local producers. As a result, that BC brewery found it genuinely easier to export to Washington state than to sell in Ontario. American customs was less complicated than Canadian provincial bureaucracy. Or consider construction. A carpenter certified in Nova Scotia couldn't just move to Alberta and start working due to different licensing requirements, different certification standards, and different regulatory bodies that refused to recognize each other's credentials. You could be a master tradesperson with 20 years of experience, but crossing a provincial border meant starting over. The numbers were staggering. Economists estimated these internal trade barriers cost the Canadian economy between $50 and $130 billion annually. That's roughly 5 to 7% of the entire Canadian economy just vanishing into bureaucratic friction. Think about that. Canada spent decades lecturing other countries about the benefits of free trade while maintaining internal barriers that destroyed more economic value than most tariffs ever could. The Supreme Court even got involved in a case that became almost a national joke. They ruled that a man couldn't transport beer he legally purchased in Quebec across the border into New Brunswick for personal use. You could own the beer, you just couldn't move it between provinces. So why did this insanity persist for so long? Provincial protectionism, pure and simple. Every province had industries it wanted to protect. Quebec protected its dairy farmers, Ontario protected its construction unions, British Columbia protected its wine industry, and Alberta protected its professional licensing bodies. Canadian federalism gave provinces enormous power to maintain these barriers. The Constitution actually allows provinces to regulate trade within their borders, so Quebec could legally say, if you want to sell milk here, you need to follow our rules, even if those rules were deliberately designed to keep out milk from other provinces. Politicians knew it was economically destructive. Reports came out every few years documenting the damage. Business groups complained constantly, and economists published papers showing how much prosperity was being sacrificed. But changing it required provinces to voluntarily give up power and protection for local industries, which required political courage. For decades, no one had enough of it. There were attempts at reform. The Agreement on Internal Trade in 1994, the New West Partnership in 2010, and various bilateral agreements between provinces, but all of them had more loopholes than actual rules. All of them preserved the core barriers that mattered most. By 2024, Canada had arguably the most fragmented internal market of any developed federation in the world. The European Union had freer internal trade than Canada. The United States certainly did. Even Australia, another federation with strong states, had managed to mostly eliminate internal barriers. Canada was the outlier, and everyone knew it. They just couldn't fix it. When Trump started threatening Canadian trade access in early 2025, the initial response was predictable panic. Canadian business groups warned of economic catastrophe, politicians scrambled to find leverage, and economists calculated the potential damage. But something else happened too, something unexpected. Canadian leaders looked at their economy and realized, we've been so focused on defending access to American markets that we've completely neglected our own internal market. We've spent decades making it easier to trade with the United States than with each other. Mark Carney, newly elected as Prime Minister specifically to stand up to Trump, saw the strategic opening. If Trump was going to make American markets unreliable, Canada needed alternatives. And the fastest, most accessible alternative wasn't Asia or Europe. It was the market that already existed between Canadian provinces. But accessing that market required tearing down barriers that had stood for generations. It required convincing premiers to give up protections for local industries. It required political courage that had been absent for 50 years. Except now, there was something that made courage easier: fear. Fear that Trump would actually follow through on his threats. Fear that American markets could vanish overnight. Fear that Canada's entire economic model was built on a foundation that could crumble at any moment. Carney didn't waste time. Within weeks of taking office, he invited all 10 premiers to Ottawa for what he called a National Economic Summit. The message was blunt: we can keep protecting provincial interests and watch our economy collapse, or we can finally build a real national market and have somewhere to pivot when American access gets cut off. The premiers, facing furious constituents worried about American tariffs, suddenly found reasons to cooperate that had never existed before. What emerged was the most comprehensive reform of internal Canadian trade in history, not incremental changes or agreements with loopholes, but a fundamental restructuring. The new Canadian Free Trade Agreement, hastily negotiated over 3 months of intense provincial bargaining, did something previous agreements never managed. It actually eliminated barriers instead of just promising to study them. Professional credentials became portable across provinces. A nurse licensed in Ontario could work in British Columbia without retraining. An electrician from Alberta could take jobs in Quebec. A lawyer from Nova Scotia could practice in Manitoba. Regulatory standards were harmonized. If a product met federal safety standards, it could be sold in any province. No more separate labeling requirements. No more unique packaging rules designed to disadvantage outside producers. Provincial procurement barriers fell. Government contracts that had quietly favored local companies for decades were open to bidding from anywhere in Canada. A construction company from Saskatchewan could compete for projects in New Brunswick on equal terms. Even the sacred cow of supply management started cracking. Provinces agreed to phase out rules that prevented dairy, eggs, and poultry from crossing provincial borders freely. It wasn't complete elimination. The agricultural lobby was still too powerful, but it was movement that had been impossible for 60 years. The agreement included something crucial that previous attempts had lacked: enforcement mechanisms with teeth. If a province violated the rules, other provinces could retaliate with their own barriers or file complaints that triggered mandatory arbitration. No more polite suggestions that everyone ignored. The results came faster than anyone expected. Within 6 months, interprovincial trade grew by 18%, the largest increase in decades. Companies that had written off other provinces as too complicated to bother with suddenly found new markets. A tech company in Waterloo could sell services to government agencies in Vancouver without navigating different procurement rules. A food processor in Quebec could distribute products across Atlantic Canada without relabeling everything 4 different ways. The professional credential recognition had immediate effects. Provinces facing worker shortages, particularly in healthcare and skilled trades, could finally tap into labor pools from across the country. Nurses from oversupplied provinces moved to understaffed ones. Construction workers followed projects instead of being trapped by licensing barriers. Housing construction, which had been strangled by provincial protectionism and local licensing restrictions, suddenly accelerated. A construction company could operate nationally instead of being limited to one province. Competition increased and costs started dropping. Even the wine industry, which had fought interprovincial trade harder than almost anyone, found unexpected benefits. Yes, British Columbia wineries now faced competition from Ontario and Quebec, but they also gained access to markets they'd never been able to reach. Freed from having to navigate different provincial rules, they could focus on actually making better wine instead of managing compliance paperwork. The economic models had predicted significant gains from eliminating internal trade barriers, but the models had assumed gradual implementation over years. This was happening in months, and the results were exceeding projections. Here's the delicious irony that Trump completely missed. His entire strategy was built on the assumption that Canada was dependent on American markets and had nowhere else to go. 75% of Canadian exports went to the United States. Trump thought that meant Canada was trapped. Instead, his threats pushed Canada to unlock a market that had been sitting unused the entire time: itself. Canada has 40 million people and a $2 trillion economy. That's not small. That's roughly equivalent to Spain or South Korea. For decades, Canadian businesses had treated this as 40 separate provincial markets with 40 sets of rules. Now, suddenly, it was one market. The math was straightforward. If eliminating internal barriers added even 5% to economic growth, a conservative estimate, that's $100 billion in new economic activity. Not from exports, not from foreign investment, just from Canadians trading more efficiently with each other. Trump thought he was cutting off Canada's access to American markets. He was actually forcing Canada to realize it didn't need American markets as desperately as he assumed, and the strategic implications go way beyond simple trade numbers. Every dollar of increased internal Canadian trade is a dollar less dependent on American market access. Every business that learns to operate nationally instead of focusing on American exports is a business that can withstand American tariffs. Every worker who can move freely between provinces is a worker who's less vulnerable to American economic pressure. Trump wanted to demonstrate American leverage. He accidentally triggered changes that reduced American leverage. The transformation is still unfolding, but the direction is clear. Canada is finally building the integrated national economy it should have had decades ago. Businesses are restructuring their operations around national rather than provincial markets. Supply chains that made no sense because of internal barriers suddenly become logical. Investment that had been distorted by provincial protectionism can flow to wherever it's most productive. The labor market is becoming genuinely national for the first time. Workers can follow opportunities instead of being trapped by certification barriers. Skills shortages in one region can be filled by surplus workers from another. The entire economy becomes more flexible and efficient. Even politically, something has shifted. Premiers who spent their careers defending provincial jurisdiction are now voluntarily accepting federal coordination because they've seen the benefits. The old fights about federal versus provincial power haven't disappeared, but they've become less reflexive. The business community is celebrating. The Canadian Chamber of Commerce called it the most significant economic reform in a generation. Industry groups that had been lobbying for internal trade reform for decades are watching changes they never thought they'd see. And it's all because Trump thought threatening Canada would make Canada weaker. This story illustrates something fundamental that Trump has never understood about international relations. Pressure can backfire spectacularly when it forces your target to make changes they should have made anyway. Trump assumed Canada was static, that Canadian weakness was permanent, and that 75% trade dependence on the United States was an unchangeable fact rather than a policy choice. He never considered that his threats might push Canada to finally address internal dysfunctions that had been holding it back for decades. He never imagined that economic pressure might force reforms that actually made Canada stronger and more resilient. This is what happens when you treat allies with contempt and assume they have no options. They find options, or they create options, or they discover that the options were there all along, just waiting for the right motivation to pursue them. Mark Carney understood this. He used Trump's threats as the catalyst Canada needed to overcome decades of provincial infighting and bureaucratic inertia. He turned American pressure into Canadian reform. He transformed what Trump intended as punishment into an opportunity for fundamental restructuring. And now, Canada has something it hasn't had in generations, a genuinely integrated national economy that's less dependent on American goodwill and more capable of withstanding American pressure. The internal trade reforms are just beginning. The agreement covers the easy parts, the barriers that everyone agreed were stupid but no one had fixed. The hard parts are still coming. Supply management in agriculture remains mostly intact. Provincial control over natural resources hasn't changed. Professional licensing is more portable, but there are still gaps and exceptions. The process is far from complete, but the momentum is real. Provinces that spent decades fighting over jurisdiction are now competing to implement reforms faster than their neighbors. Business groups that never thought they'd see meaningful change are pushing for more. The political dynamic has fundamentally shifted, and Trump's threats keep providing motivation. Every time he tweets about Canada being a failing state or suggests new tariffs, Canadian politicians point to internal trade reform as proof that Canada can adapt and thrive without American approval. Trump expected Canada to come crawling back, desperate for American market access on whatever terms he offered. Instead, Canada is building an economy that works better internally and depends less on external validation. The empty chair at Trump's negotiating table isn't because Canada is too weak to negotiate. It's because Canada is too busy making itself stronger to waste time on Trump's demands. And every day that passes, every trade barrier that falls, and every business that expands nationally instead of focusing on American exports, Canada becomes a little bit less vulnerable to exactly the kind of pressure Trump thought was his ultimate weapon. Trump wanted to demonstrate American power. He accidentally triggered Canadian renewal. And the country that emerges from this transformation will be more resilient, more integrated, and more independent than the country Trump thought he could bully into submission. That's not the story Trump wanted to write, but it's the one Mark Carney is delivering.